"Rex, what is it, boy?" The question barely left Caleb Mercer's lips before the dog's bark tore through the quiet like something alive and urgent, something that didn't belong in the stillness of that old, broken place. The house had been silent for 3 days, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until you started hearing things that weren't there, but this wasn't that. This was real. Rex stood at the back door, body stiff, ears forward, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest as he stared toward the overgrown yard behind the house, the same yard Caleb had ignored since he arrived, too tired, too empty to care about anything beyond the 4 walls that barely felt like home anymore. Caleb exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, the rough stubble scratching against his palm as he tried to shake off the weight that had followed him back from everything he'd lost, the marriage, the money, the version of himself that used to wake up knowing what the day was for. "It's nothing," he muttered, more to himself than the dog, but Rex didn't move. The German shepherd took 1 step back, then forward again, paw hitting the wood with a sharp, impatient tap before he turned his head and looked straight at Caleb, not like a pet waiting for permission, but like a partner expecting action. That look did something to him. It cut through the fog. Caleb grabbed his jacket from the chair without thinking and stepped outside, the cold morning air biting just enough to remind him he was still here, still breathing. The grass was uneven and damp beneath his boots, the yard stretching out in patches of wild weeds and forgotten corners, and Rex didn't hesitate. He moved fast, nose low, weaving a line Caleb couldn't see, straight toward the far edge where an old wooden hatch sat half-hidden beneath dirt and leaves, something Caleb had barely noticed when he first walked the property. The dog reached it and started digging, claws tearing at the soil, breath coming hard now, focused, determined, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Hey, hey, slow down," Caleb called, stepping closer, but Rex didn't stop. The wood beneath the dirt began to show, warped, weathered, the edges cracked from years of neglect. Caleb frowned, crouching beside it, brushing away the loose soil with his hands as a strange tension built in his chest, something tight and unfamiliar, like instinct trying to wake up after being buried too long. "What are you trying to show me?" he whispered, more serious now. Rex let out a sharp bark and stepped back just enough for Caleb to get a grip on the rusted handle. It resisted at first, stuck from time and rot, but then it gave with a dull creak that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet yard. And then, something else. Not the wind. Not the shifting of wood. A sound. Faint. Hollow. Like a small knock from somewhere deep below. Caleb froze, every muscle in his body going still as his breath caught in his throat. Rex didn't bark this time. He just stood there, eyes locked on the opening, waiting. Caleb leaned closer, heart beginning to pound, the silence pressing in again, but now it wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. Then it came again. A soft, trembling sound from the darkness beneath his hands, just enough to make one thing clear. He wasn't alone out here anymore. Caleb did not move for a full second, as if even the smallest motion might erase what he had just heard, but the sound came again, soft and uneven, like someone trying to be brave without the strength to be loud, and that was enough to break the stillness inside him. "Hello?" he called down into the darkness, his voice careful, steady, the way he used to speak when everything depended on keeping control. No answer, just the faint echo of his own words brushing against the hollow space below, but Rex stepped closer to the opening, lowering his head and letting out a quiet whine that Caleb had never heard before, not in all the years they had been together. It was not fear. It was concern. Caleb swallowed, then reached for his phone, switching on the flashlight as the beam cut through the dust and settled into the narrow space beneath the hatch, revealing the rough outline of a small underground storage cellar, the kind people built decades ago for storms or supplies, now forgotten, left to time. The light trembled slightly in his hand as he leaned closer, angling it down. "Hey," he said again, softer now, his voice losing its edge and becoming something warmer, something human. "You are not in trouble. I just need to know if you are okay." There was a pause, long enough that doubt tried to creep back in, long enough for the cold air to settle against his neck, and then, barely audible, a voice answered. Please, do not let them find me. Caleb's chest tightened, not from panic, but from recognition, the kind that did not come from logic but from something deeper, something that remembered what it felt like to be small in a world that did not feel safe. No one is here but me, he replied immediately, firm now, grounded. And my dog. His name is Rex. He is the one who found you. At the sound of his name, Rex shifted closer, his tail low but moving slightly, as if he understood every word being said. Caleb adjusted the light again, lowering himself onto one knee so he could see better, and that was when he caught the first clear glimpse of her. She was small, no more than 8 years old, wrapped in layers that did not quite fit, her hands clutched tightly around something he could not fully see, her eyes wide but not wild, alert in a way that told him she had been watching, waiting, thinking. She did not move away from the light, but she did not come toward it either. She was measuring him. What is your name? Caleb asked, keeping his tone even, giving her space to answer on her own time. Another pause, shorter this time. Ellie, she said, her voice steadier than before, though it carried the weight of someone who had not slept well in a long time. Caleb nodded, even though she could barely see the gesture. Okay, Ellie, he said quietly. My name is Caleb. I am going to help you get out of there, but I need you to tell me if you are hurt. She shook her head, a small motion, almost invisible, but enough. Just cold, she whispered. Caleb glanced at Rex, then back at the opening, his mind already shifting into motion, piecing together what needed to happen next. All right, he said. I am going to open this a little more and then I will help you. Up. Rex is going to stay right here with us. You are safe. The words felt unfamiliar coming out of his mouth, not because they were untrue, but because it had been a long time since he had believed them himself. He pulled at the edge of the hatch, widening the opening just enough, then reached down carefully, offering his hand, not grabbing, not rushing. For a moment, Ellie did not take it. She looked past him instead, straight at Rex, and something in her expression softened just enough to let the tension shift. The dog lowered himself to the ground, calm, steady, watching her with quiet patience. That was when she moved. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her small hand in Caleb's, her grip light but certain, and he felt it then, not just the weight of her as he helped guide her up, but the weight of something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the past he had been running from and everything to do with what had just found him instead. Ellie's fingers tightened slightly around Caleb's hand as her feet found solid ground, her balance uncertain for a moment before she steadied herself, and the first thing she did was not look at him but at Rex, as if confirming something unspoken, something that mattered more than anything Caleb could say. The dog remained still, calm, his presence quiet but firm, and after a second, Ellie took a small step closer to him, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension in her posture easing like a breath she had been holding for too long. Caleb noticed it immediately. He let go of her hand slowly, careful not to rush the moment, and reached back to pull his jacket tighter around her shoulders, the fabric hanging loose but warm. Come on, he said gently, nodding toward the house. Let us get you inside. Ellie hesitated, her eyes flicking once toward the tree line beyond the yard, scanning it with a kind of awareness that did not belong to someone her age, then she nodded once and followed him, staying close enough to Rex that her hand brushed lightly against the dog's back as they walked. The kitchen felt different when they stepped inside, no longer empty, no longer echoing with absence. Caleb moved quickly. Not out of panic, but out of purpose, grabbing a clean towel from the drawer, setting a kettle on the stove, the familiar rhythm of simple actions grounding him in a way nothing had for weeks. Ellie stood near the doorway at first, unsure, her eyes moving across the room, taking in every detail as if memorizing exits, distances, the placement of objects. Rex settled near her feet, lowering himself onto the floor with a quiet exhale, his presence anchoring the space. You can sit, Caleb said, pulling out a chair and placing it a few feet away from him, not too close, not too far. Ellie watched him for a moment, then moved slowly, climbing onto the chair and tucking her legs in beneath her, the oversized jacket pooling around her like a shield. Caleb poured hot water into a mug, added cocoa powder from a container he had barely used since moving in, and slid it across the table toward her. "It is warm," he said. "Take your time." Ellie reached for it carefully, her fingers wrapping around the mug, absorbing the heat, and for a brief second, her eyes closed, not in fear, but in relief. The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was waiting. Caleb leaned back slightly, giving her space, watching without staring. "You said you did not want them to find you," he said after a moment, his voice low, steady. "Who are them?" Ellie's eyes opened again, and the softness that had just touched her face faded into something more guarded, more deliberate. She shook her head, not refusing, but postponing. "I just needed to stay somewhere quiet," she said instead, her voice careful with each word. "Somewhere no one would look." Caleb nodded slowly. He did not push. He knew that look. He had seen it in mirrors he avoided now. "All right," he said. "You can stay here for now." Ellie's grip tightened slightly on the mug. "You are not going to call anyone?" she asked, the question quiet but direct. Caleb paused, just for a second, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood the weight behind the question. "I am going to make sure you are safe," he said finally, choosing each word with intention. "That comes first." Ellie studied him, searching for something in his face, something that could not be faked. Then, slowly, she nodded. Rex shifted again, resting his head lightly against her leg, and this time, she did not pull away. Instead, her free hand moved almost without thinking, settling gently against the dog's fur, fingers curling slightly as if holding on to something real for the first time in a long while. Caleb watched the moment quietly, something unfamiliar settling in his chest, not the sharp ache he had grown used to, but something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of a reason. And then he noticed it. The object Ellie had been holding since the moment she came out of the cellar. A small, worn item clutched close to her side, partially hidden beneath the folds of the jacket. He did not ask about it. Not yet. But something about the way she held it told him it mattered. Not just to her, but to whatever had brought her here. And whatever that was, Caleb knew one thing for certain. This was not over. Not even close. The steam from the mug had begun to thin, curling softly into the quiet air as Ellie held it close, her fingers no longer trembling as much, but still not entirely steady, and Caleb noticed the way she kept her body angled slightly toward Rex, as if the dog was not just comfort but a boundary, something that separated her from everything else she was not ready to face. He moved slowly around the kitchen, not to fill the space with noise, but to give it shape, opening a cabinet, pulling down a bowl, setting it on the counter with a soft, deliberate motion, each small sound grounding the room further into something that felt lived in again. "Are you hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice even, casual, like this was any ordinary morning and not the beginning of something he did not yet understand. Ellie looked down at the mug, then back up at him, her expression uncertain, as if the question itself required careful thought. After a moment, she nodded once. Caleb gave a small nod in return and reached for a loaf of bread, slicing 2 pieces with steady hands, spreading a thin layer of peanut butter across one, then another, the familiar action easing something tight in his chest. He placed the plate on the table within her reach and stepped back again. Ellie hesitated, then reached out, taking one half slowly, her movements measured, like someone who had learned not to assume anything was truly hers until it was gone. She took a small bite, then another, and though she said nothing, the pace quickened just slightly, enough for Caleb to understand. He turned his attention to the sink, rinsing his hands under the faucet, giving her the privacy of not being watched too closely, even though he was aware of every movement she made. "You said you needed somewhere no one would look," he said after a moment, not turning around yet. "This place is pretty far out. How did you find it?" The question lingered in the air, gentle but intentional. Ellie did not answer right away. Caleb dried his hands and turned back slowly, leaning lightly against the counter, keeping his posture open, non-threatening. She was watching him again, that same careful evaluation in her eyes, weighing something deeper than the words he had asked. Finally, she spoke. "I did not find it," she said quietly. "He did." Her hand moved slightly, almost unconsciously, resting against Rex's back. The dog's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but he did not move otherwise. Caleb's gaze followed the gesture, then returned to her face. "Rex?" he asked, surprised, though he kept it from showing too much. Ellie nodded. "I was near the road," she said, her voice still soft, but more certain now. "I saw him first. He kept coming closer, then walking away, then looking back at me. Like he wanted me to follow." Caleb felt something shift inside him, something that made the moment feel less like coincidence and more like a thread being pulled from somewhere he could not see. He glanced at Rex, who now looked up briefly, meeting his eyes with a calm that carried no explanation, only quiet certainty. "He brought you here," Caleb said slowly, more to himself than to her. Ellie gave a small nod, then tightened her hold on the mug again, her shoulders drawing in just slightly. "It was safer than the road," she added, almost as if she needed to justify the choice. Caleb pushed himself off the counter and walked to the table, stopping a few feet away, careful not to close the distance too quickly. "Ellie," he said gently, "the thing you are holding, is it important?" Her reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Her arms drew in around the object, shielding it, her posture closing just enough to answer the question without words. Caleb raised a hand slightly, a small gesture of reassurance. "You do not have to show me," he said quickly. "Not unless you want to." Ellie watched him closely, her breathing quiet but deliberate, and for a moment, it seemed like she might refuse entirely. Then, slowly, she shifted, pulling the object out from beneath the jacket just enough for him to see. It was small, worn at the edges, something that had been held many times before, something that mattered. Caleb did not lean in. He did not reach. He just looked, letting her control how much was revealed. "It helps me remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. Caleb nodded once, understanding more than she realized. "Then we will keep it safe," he replied. Ellie's eyes flickered, something soft passing through them again, something that had not been there when she first stepped out of the darkness. Rex shifted closer, pressing gently against her leg, and this time, when she rested her hand against his fur, there was no hesitation at all. And as Caleb stood there, in a kitchen that no longer felt empty, he realized that whatever had brought Ellie into his life had already begun to change it in ways he could not yet fully see, but could no longer ignore. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second stretching thin across the quiet kitchen as if time itself had slowed down to watch what would happen next, and Caleb found himself standing there longer than he meant to, his eyes drifting once more to the small object Ellie had pulled from beneath the jacket before she gently tucked it back out of sight, like something too important to leave exposed for long. He did not ask again. Some things were not meant to be rushed, and whatever that was, it belonged to her story, not his. Rex shifted beside her, his head lifting slightly, ears turning toward the back of the house, and Caleb noticed the change immediately, that subtle alertness returning, the same one that had led them to the cellar in the first place. "What is it?" Caleb asked quietly, though he already knew the dog would not answer in words. Rex stood, moving toward the back door again, but this time slower, more deliberate, pausing once to glance back at Caleb, then at Ellie, as if checking that both of them were still there. Ellie's posture stiffened just slightly, her hand tightening around the mug, her eyes following Rex with a kind of quiet understanding that made Caleb's chest tighten again. "He does that when something is not right," she said softly, almost to herself. Caleb nodded once, grabbing his jacket again without hesitation this time. "Stay here," he said, then paused, reconsidering as he looked at her. The hesitation did not go unnoticed. Ellie set the mug down carefully. "I can stay by the door," she offered, her voice steady, not asking, just stating what she was willing to do. Caleb studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. All right. But you stay where I can see you. She nodded once, sliding off the chair and moving toward the doorway, Rex already waiting there, his body angled outward toward the yard. The cold air met them again as Caleb stepped outside, the same damp ground beneath his boots, the same quiet stretching across the property, but it did not feel the same anymore. It felt watched. Rex moved ahead, not running this time, but tracking, nose low, steps measured as he led Caleb past the cellar hatch, further along the edge of the yard toward the thin line of trees that separated the property from the old dirt road beyond. Caleb followed closely, his senses sharpening with each step, not from fear, but from something he had not felt in a long time. Focus. Rex stopped suddenly near a patch of disturbed earth, not freshly dug, but not entirely settled either, and began pawing at it again, slower this time, careful, as if uncovering something that needed to be revealed without being damaged. Caleb crouched beside him, brushing the dirt away with his hands, his fingers catching on fabric beneath the surface. He pulled gently, revealing a small, worn backpack, the kind a child might carry, faded, scuffed, but intact. Caleb's breath slowed, his mind already connecting the pieces before he fully understood them. He opened the zipper carefully, not rushing, and inside he found a few items, nothing loud, nothing dramatic, but each one carrying weight. A folded piece of paper, creased from being opened too many times. A small flashlight with weak batteries. A snack wrapper, empty. And a photograph, slightly bent at the corners. Caleb held the photo up to the light, his eyes narrowing as he took it in. It showed a younger Ellie, standing beside another child, both of them smiling in a way that felt almost unreal compared to the girl now standing back at the house. There was an adult figure behind them, partly cut off, face not fully visible, but present enough to matter. Caleb exhaled slowly, his grip tightening just slightly around the edge of the photo. Rex nudged his arm gently, grounding him, bringing him back to the moment. Caleb looked up toward the house, where Ellie stood just inside the doorway, watching, her small frame outlined against the dim interior. She knew. Not everything, but enough. Caleb stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, the backpack still in his grip, and began walking back toward her, each step heavier than the last, not because of what he carried, but because of what it meant. This was not just a girl who had found a place to hide. This was a trail. And Rex had just found the next piece of it. Ellie did not step back when Caleb approached, but she did not step forward either, her eyes fixed on the backpack in his hand long before he reached the door, as if she had already recognized it from the way he carried it, from the careful grip that said this was not just something found, but something understood. Rex slipped past Caleb first, returning to her side with quiet purpose, brushing gently against her leg as if to say that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Caleb stopped just inside the doorway, the cold air lingering behind him before the door clicked shut, sealing them back into the warmth of the kitchen, though the air inside felt different now, charged with something unspoken. He set the backpack on the table slowly, not pushing it toward her, not opening it again, simply placing it there where it could be seen. Ellie's fingers tightened at her sides, her gaze lowering to the worn fabric, tracing every scuff and crease without touching it. "Is it yours?" Caleb asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Ellie nodded once, her movement small but certain. "I dropped it," she said, her voice steady but softer than before. "When I ran." The words hung there, simple, but heavy enough to shift the room again. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down, not across from her, but slightly to the side, giving her space while still staying present. "You ran from the road," he said, piecing it together, not as a question, but as a way of showing he was listening. Ellie's eyes flicked up to him for a moment, then back to the backpack. "From the truck," she corrected quietly. Caleb did not react immediately. He let the word settle, not pushing it further, not letting it become something bigger than she was ready to explain. "Okay," he said after a moment. "From the truck." Ellie reached out slowly, her hand hovering over the backpack before finally resting against it, her fingers pressing lightly into the fabric as if confirming it was real, that it had not disappeared while she was hiding. She pulled it closer, unzipping it just enough to look inside, her shoulders relaxing a fraction when she saw what remained. The photograph. The flashlight. The folded paper. Caleb watched her carefully, noticing how she did not rush through the contents, how each item was checked with quiet intention, like pieces of a puzzle she needed to keep intact. There was another girl, he said gently, his voice low, careful not to startle her. In the picture. Ellie froze for a second, then slowly looked up at him, her expression shifting, not into fear, but into something deeper, something protective. That is my friend, she said, her voice gaining a small edge of strength. Her name is Lily. Caleb nodded once, absorbing the name, letting it settle. Is she with you? He asked, though something in his chest already told him the answer would not be simple. Ellie shook her head, her grip tightening slightly on the edge of the backpack. We got separated, she said, and for the first time, there was a faint crack in her voice, not breaking, but bending under the weight of something she had been holding in for too long. Rex shifted again, lifting his head and pressing it gently against her arm, and Ellie leaned into him just enough to steady herself. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his posture open, grounded. Ellie, he said softly, you did the right thing coming here. She looked at him then, really looked this time, searching his face for something that could hold that statement up. I did not come here, she replied quietly. He brought me. Her hand moved again to Rex, her fingers curling into his fur with quiet certainty. Caleb followed the motion, then nodded slowly, something inside him aligning in a way he could not fully explain. Then he knew where you needed to be, Caleb said, his voice steady, not as a guess, but as a truth he was choosing to believe. Ellie's eyes softened just slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing enough to let her breathe a little deeper. Caleb sat back, letting the silence settle again, but this time it was different. It was no longer just about what had already happened. It was about what still needed to be done. He glanced once at the backpack, then at Ellie, then at Rex, who remained still but alert, as if waiting for the next move. Caleb exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing in, but not pushing him down. Not this time. We are going to find her, he said quietly. Ellie's head lifted at that, her eyes widening just slightly, hope flickering in a way that felt fragile but real. Caleb held her gaze, steady, certain, not making a promise he could not keep, but making a decision he would not walk away from. And for the first time since he stepped back into that empty house, he was no longer just reacting to what life had taken from him. He was choosing what to do with what had been placed in front of him. The word find hung in the air between them, quiet but solid, like something that had already taken root, and Ellie did not speak right away, but the way her shoulders straightened just slightly, the way her fingers loosened their grip on the backpack, told Caleb that it mattered more than anything else he could have said. Rex lifted his head again, his ears angling toward the front of the house this time, and Caleb noticed the shift instantly, his body responding before his mind could fully catch up. There was a faint sound outside, not loud, not alarming, just enough to break the stillness that had settled over the room. Tires on gravel. Slow. Distant, but approaching. Ellie's eyes snapped toward the window, her breath catching, not in panic, but in recognition. They do not usually come this far, she whispered, her voice tightening just enough to change the room again. Caleb stood up immediately, his movements controlled, deliberate, the same quiet focus returning to him as he crossed to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out. A truck. Older model. Moving along the dirt road that ran past the property, not turning in, not yet, but not in a hurry either. Just passing. Or watching. Caleb let the curtain fall back into place, his jaw tightening slightly, his mind already working through possibilities, none of them simple, none of them something he could ignore anymore. It might just be someone passing through, he said, his voice calm, steady, though he did not look at Ellie when he said it. He looked at Rex. The dog was not relaxed. He was not barking either. He was alert. Watching. Waiting. That told Caleb more than anything else. Ellie slid off the chair quietly, her movements careful, practiced, as if she had done this before. She moved closer to Rex, her hand finding his fur again without hesitation. "They do not pass slow," she said softly. Caleb turned back to her then, really looking, seeing not just a child who had been scared, but someone who had learned to read the world in ways most people never had to. He nodded once. "Okay," he said. "Then we do not take chances." He moved quickly now, not rushed, but purposeful, walking to the back of the house and checking the lock on the door, then the windows, each one secure, each movement quiet and controlled. He returned to the kitchen, stopping a few feet from Ellie, lowering himself slightly so he was closer to her level without crowding her space. "Listen to me," he said gently. "You stay close to Rex. If I tell you to move, you move. No questions. All right?" Ellie held his gaze, her expression serious, and nodded once. "All right." The sound of the truck faded, rolling past the edge of the property and continuing down the road, but the tension did not leave with it. It lingered, thin and sharp, like a thread pulled too tight. Caleb remained still for a moment, listening, counting the seconds in his head the way he used to, not out of habit, but out of necessity. When nothing followed, when the quiet returned in full, he exhaled slowly, but did not relax completely. Rex shifted, stepping toward the door again, his posture changing from alert to intent, as if the passing truck had not ended anything, but pointed him in a direction. Caleb followed the movement, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You have something else," he murmured, more to the dog than to anyone else. Rex looked back at him, then toward the door again, a clear, silent signal. Ellie noticed it too. "He wants to go," she said, her voice steady again, though still quiet. Caleb glanced at her, then back at Rex, weighing the moment, understanding what it meant. Staying here might keep them safe for now. But it would not find Lily. It would not answer the questions already building around them. And Rex was not reacting out of fear. He was leading. Caleb grabbed a flashlight from the counter, slipping it into his pocket, then reached for his keys, though he did not head for the truck. Not yet. He looked at Ellie again, making sure she was ready, not just willing. "We are going to follow him," he said. Ellie nodded, her hand tightening briefly on Rex's fur before releasing, her posture steady, her eyes clear. Caleb opened the door slowly, the cool air rushing in again, carrying the quiet of the land with it, but now it felt different. Not empty. Not waiting. Moving. Rex stepped out first, confident, focused, his path already chosen. Caleb followed, and Ellie stayed close behind, the three of them moving together into something none of them could fully see yet, but all of them understood they could not ignore. Rex moved with quiet certainty, his step steady as he crossed the yard and slipped past the thin line of trees, his body low but not tense, as if he was following something he trusted rather than something he feared, and Caleb kept close behind, his eyes scanning the ground, the shadows, the spaces between branches where anything could be hidden or nothing at all, the kind of awareness that came not from panic but from experience. Ellie stayed just behind him, close enough that he could hear her breathing, soft but controlled, her small steps careful on the uneven earth, her gaze moving not randomly but with intention, as if she was reading the same invisible map Rex was following. The air grew cooler beneath the trees, the light thinning as branches filtered the morning sun into narrow beams that shifted with every step, and the quiet deepened into something almost complete, broken only by the faint crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of the road fading further behind them. Rex slowed as they reached a narrow path, barely visible, more a suggestion than a trail, winding deeper into the woods toward a structure that Caleb had not noticed before, half hidden by overgrowth and time. It was small, old, and leaning slightly to one side, its wooden boards weathered to a dull gray, the roof sagging just enough to tell a story of years without care. Caleb stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he took it in, not rushing forward, not assuming anything. Rex approached first, circling once, then twice, his nose tracing the edges of the structure, pausing at the door before stepping back and looking at Caleb again, that same silent signal returning. Ellie moved closer, her steps slowing as recognition flickered across her face, not fear, not exactly, but something close to it, something that remembered. "I have seen this place," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the stillness. Caleb glanced at her, then back at the structure, the pieces aligning. In his mind with a clarity that felt both sharp and heavy. "When?" he asked, keeping his tone even. Ellie hesitated, then answered. "Before I ran." The word settled into the space between them, simple, but carrying enough weight to shift everything again. Caleb stepped forward slowly, his hand reaching for the door, testing it first, feeling the resistance of old wood before it gave with a soft, uneven creak. He opened it just enough to let the light slip inside, not stepping in immediately, allowing his eyes to adjust, allowing the space to reveal itself without force. Inside, it was small, bare, the air still and cool, carrying the faint scent of dust and something else, something recent enough to matter. There were signs of use, not obvious, not arranged, but present in the small details, a folded blanket in the corner, a plastic bottle half filled with water, a piece of cloth draped over a wooden crate. Caleb stepped inside carefully, his movements slow, controlled, his eyes taking in every detail without rushing to conclusions. Rex followed, his posture calm but attentive, moving to the far side of the room and stopping near the corner, his nose lowering to the floor before lifting again, his gaze shifting toward the back wall. Ellie remained just outside the doorway at first, her hand resting against the frame, her body still, as if crossing that threshold required something she was not ready to give yet. Caleb turned slightly, noticing, and softened his stance just enough. "You do not have to come in," he said gently. Ellie shook her head, then stepped forward anyway, one small step at a time, until she stood just inside, her eyes moving across the space with quiet recognition. "We were here," she said, her voice steady but distant, like she was speaking from a memory instead of the present. Caleb followed her gaze, then looked back at Rex, who had not moved from his spot near the back wall. "What is it?" Caleb murmured. Rex shifted slightly, pawing once at the base of the wall, not digging, just marking the place. Caleb approached, crouching down, his fingers brushing along the wood until he felt it, a slight gap, barely visible, a seam that did not belong. He pressed gently, and a narrow panel gave way, revealing a hidden space behind it, small, concealed, and inside, another item. A second photograph, older, more worn, its edges softened from time, and when Caleb lifted it into the light, his breath slowed. It showed Ellie and Lily again, but this time they were not alone. The same adult figure stood behind them, fully visible now, face clear, expression unreadable but important. Caleb's grip tightened just slightly, his mind locking onto the image, onto the meaning it carried. He looked up at Ellie, who was already staring at the photograph, her eyes fixed, her body still, as if the moment had reached something she could not step away from anymore. "That is him," she said quietly. And in that instant, the path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was defined. The air inside the small structure felt heavier now, not because anything had changed physically, but because something had finally been named, and once a thing had a name, it could no longer hide in the same way. Caleb held the photograph steady, his eyes fixed on the man in the background, memorizing every detail without needing to say a word, the angle of the shoulders, the set of the jaw, the way the presence filled the space behind the two girls without touching them. Ellie did not move. Her gaze stayed locked on the image, her breathing shallow but controlled, like she was standing at the edge of something she had been trying not to see for too long. "You are sure?" Caleb asked quietly, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to anchor the moment in something solid. Ellie nodded once, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was always there." The word settled into Caleb's chest with a weight that felt familiar, not in the details, but in the shape of it, the kind of truth that did not arrive all at once, but slowly, over time, until it became impossible to ignore. Rex shifted beside him, his body relaxing just slightly, not because the tension had disappeared, but because the uncertainty had begun to take form, and that alone changed things. Caleb stood, the photograph still in his hand, and turned toward the door, the light outside. Brighter now, the world beyond the small structure waiting in a way that felt different than before. Ellie followed his movement, her steps slower, her eyes lingering on the space one last time before she stepped back out into the open air. The trees no longer felt like a barrier. They felt like a path. Caleb paused just outside, looking down at the photograph again, then at Ellie, then at Rex, who stood between them, steady, watchful, as if holding the line between what had been and what was coming next. "We are not going to handle this alone," Caleb said finally, his voice calm but firm, not wavering, not uncertain. Ellie looked up at him, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face, but it did not turn into resistance. It turned into thought. "You said you would keep me safe," she replied quietly. Caleb met her gaze without hesitation. "I will," he said. "And part of that is making sure the right people see this." He lifted the photograph slightly, not as evidence, not yet, but as something that needed to be brought into the light. Ellie watched him for a moment longer, then nodded, not fully at ease, but no longer holding back. Rex stepped forward, nudging lightly against Caleb's leg, then turning toward the path they had taken to get here, his body already aligned with the direction they needed to go. Caleb slipped the photograph carefully into his jacket, securing it close, then gestured gently toward the open trail. "We go back," he said. Ellie moved to his side, not behind him this time, her posture straighter, her steps more certain, and Rex took the lead again, guiding them out of the trees and back toward the house, toward the road, toward whatever came next. The walk back felt different. The same ground, the same distance, but no longer uncertain. Caleb's mind moved through the steps ahead, not rushing, not skipping, just building, one decision at a time. The sheriff. The report. The questions that would follow. But beneath all of that, something else had taken hold, something quieter, but stronger. Purpose. When the house came back into view, it did not look empty anymore. It looked like a place that had been waiting, not for him to return, but for him to begin again. Ellie slowed for a moment as they reached the yard, her eyes lifting to the windows, then to the door, as if seeing it differently now. Rex stopped beside her, his tail giving a small, steady motion, and she rested her hand against him without thinking, grounding herself in something real. Caleb stepped ahead, opening the door and holding it for her, not as a gesture, but as a choice, a quiet acknowledgement that she belonged here, at least for now. Ellie stepped inside, and this time, she did not hesitate. She walked in as if she had decided something for herself. Caleb followed, closing the door behind them, the sound soft but final, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he did not feel like he was standing in the aftermath of loss. He felt like he was standing at the beginning of something that mattered. Rex moved to the center of the room, lying down with a calm that filled the space, and Ellie sat nearby, her shoulders no longer drawn in, her eyes no longer searching for exits. Caleb stood for a moment, taking it in, the quiet, the presence, the shift that had taken place without warning. He reached into his jacket, touching the photograph briefly, not to check that it was still there, but to remind himself of what it meant. Then he looked at Ellie, at Rex, at the space that no longer felt empty, and he understood something simple, something steady. He had come back here with nothing. But he was not leaving this moment the same way.